Welcome, Belvie, to the Power of Partnership podcast. I am so excited and honored to be visiting with you today.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It is so mutual. I have such love and respect for Riane, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
I would love for you to share a bit with our listeners about the influence that Riane Eisler's work has had on you, and maybe share a little bit about how you first became exposed to Riane Eisler's work.
Well, this is very interesting because it does require a context because when I learned that youth violence in Los Angeles, which is, I had relatives who lived there, it had in one year the highest number of murders and killings of any, even more than I think than whatever war we were in. So I developed a curriculum coming out of my sadness around that kind of reality. And then I felt like we couldn't blame young people because they were killing each other over who's going to control a block. Adults, we have wars over who's going to also control territory. But in this instance, what I was really feeling the need to have them understand was that the block was where they lived. The universe was the larger community that we all inhabited. And so the curriculum was based on that. Fast forward, much of my work has been at the level of education and consciousness shifting. I had at that point been invited to join the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, founded by Edgar Mitchell, the sixth person, the sixth man to walk on the moon. And I was reading his book, and, he talks about having this profound insight as he was returning from space when he looked at that beautiful blue planet, just in the context of the vastness of the space. And he said to me in conversation once, and it was not something he could say to NASA, that he, in that moment, had this profound kind of breakthrough of his being related to everything and oneness. And he broke into tears. Now, that's not the kind of thing you can come back as an astronaut and be debriefed. But what it led him to do was to leave NASA and create the Institute for Noetic Sciences to explore the question that he had. Because the question that he had is he came back and he saw what was probably lightning, but for him, it could have been a bomb. He saw this, and that was what motivated his despair. And he said in that moment, the question came, when are we going to stop causing each other so much suffering? And the Institute of Noetic Sciences was created to try and have and think about, and how do we have a shift in consciousness that, allows us to address that. So in that larger context of that work, a couple of people had said to me, you and Riane Eisler should meet. I said, well, I've read some of her work, and they said, well, have you read Tomorrow's Children? And I said, no. And they said, well, when I listened to your work and what you did in South Central, you are trying to help seed the consciousness for tomorrow's children. So long story in short, that got me while I was on the board at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I did a series of conversations called Conversations That Matter. Mm-hmm. And Edgar Mitchell, Brian Swim, Vincent Harding, who was Dr. King's, comrade, and who actually wrote the Why I'm Opposed to Vietnam speech for Dr. King, was very involved. So I invited Riane. So that's when we first met, was in that conversation and dialogue. But Tomorrow's Children, what I really love, and what was an effort at projecting a future in which the consciousness that created the problem, which, we couldn't be blamed if we had no alternatives, was to begin to think about alternatives. And I feel like a blueprint for partnership education is very much part of the opening of that path. And so it's really an honor to be back in dialogue and conversation. And I felt at the time that there needed to be a place where all of this innovative education that was happening was being codified, talked about, that there had to be a place. And at that time, I didn't see the place. And but partnership for me, the partnership focus. In that sense, I'm really happy to be a part of a conversation and to be a part of this whole process of not domination. That's the answer. So
Right.
that's the long and the kind of short of the journey to now, that really I'm so happy to be talking to you in the context of the work that you're doing by way of trying to help us understand a larger context in which all of this can fit.
I would love for you to share a bit with our listeners about the inspiration that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has provided for you. I know that you met him while you were a teenager, and that that visit with him helped ignite your commitment to human and civil rights and justice. And this commitment has taken you down many deep and meaningful roads across the world.
Thank you so much. I'd be happy to. And in the interest of brevity, I just had written a paragraph about that in an essay, which I'll just read because that'll just get us right to. I was by way of context, as you've indicated, I was a 16-year-old living in San Francisco and got invited to a weekend retreat with a young minister whose name was Martin Luther King. Turns out the Quakers had invited this young minister, and then they invited 400 young people from all over California to come and spend the weekend. Well, most of them had no idea. I had a little bit of an idea of who he was because I had relatives who'd come from the South. But we arrived in Asilomar, where we were going to spend 4 days. And then the moment that we'd all been waiting for arrived. A very young Dr. King walked to the podium. Because he was so young, his message seemed very accessible, and we listened intently as he talked about the incredible courage of young people our age in the South, and the risks that they were taking, and the dangers that they were willingly facing to make the world a better place. He talked about Gandhi and the creative power of nonviolence. He talked about the redemptive power of love and how truth, goodness, righteousness, and love would always win out in the end. He talked about personal responsibility and the power that we each had to make a difference. I remember vividly how at the end of his speech, not only did he get a standing ovation, but we were on our feet and we were clapping and we were yelling and we were screaming and we were holding each other and we were crying. He spoke to our hearts. He spoke to our unformed visions of hope and possibility for the world. He appealed to our sense of fairness and justice and to the fact that we were special. Special, but not in an elitist way, he said. We're special because he knew he could trust us to keep the faith, and he could trust us to honor the sacred call of loving a better world into existence. I will always remember that he said, hate only intensifies hate in the world. Someone has to break the chain. Hate for hate ends in destruction. And as I said, it was a powerfully emotional moment for him and for us because he was out of the South. He explained to us, if we had been listening to him, in Alabama or Mississippi. Actually, we couldn't have. We would have had to have been in separate rooms as young Black students and young white students. And I think that was very eye-opening for us, but it had a profound impact because I think his faith, A, and B, his declaration that somebody has to break the cycle. And I feel so many of us left with that vision and hope and possibility. And I must say, in terms of mentoring and adult mentoring and intergenerational, this intergenerational journey that is such an important part of Riane's work, of course, the Quakers heard us. We didn't want to leave each other. We cried. We were crying on the bus. Had met people we'd never see again. And to their credit and my endearing and undying gratitude, they saw the tears, heard that we had found something together, and now we were going back to our high school. So they managed to keep us together as a group for a year. But just the fact that they were willing to just understand what a profound and transformative impact this had been, and then to reorganize what they had planned to do to keep us together for a year. And we met every other month. And the first thing we did was we went out and cleaned the beach together. We did something together that was helpful for somebody else. And then the afternoon after lunch, we sat in circle and we talked about, what was going on with us. And I learned very much because it was the first time I had felt really heard by adults. I think all of us did. The adults just simply held the space for us to talk about who we were and how we were. And I've been thinking a lot about intergenerational wisdom sharing. And I realize that what I've written about in that encounter, of course, is Dr. King. But what I also realized recently or belatedly, that was not in isolation. I had my grandmother, 8th grade education from the South in Alabama, Mississippi, and had lived in the South. But I remember, I think it's when the 4 young girls were killed in that church in Alabama, in Birmingham. And I was, as a teenager, it could have been me in Sunday school, and I was very rattled, and I was just talking about how was crying and saying how I hated those people that did that. And I realized one of the few times I've seen her angry was she stopped and came to the table where I was sitting and crying and took my hand, and she insisted that I look at her. And I looked at her, and as her only grandchild, I was just her angel. But it was for the first time that I saw her upset with me. She said, "I need you to look at me." And she said, "In this house, we don't hate anybody."
Mm.
And I was angry because I said, "Well, I hope they're telling their children the same." She said, "No, no, no, no. You need to listen to me. In this house, we don't hate anybody." And I came to understand later that she didn't say we don't hate anybody. She was establishing the parameters that she controlled. In her house, this is not conversation we can have. And I realized that, Dr. King's talking about hate only intensifies hate, and somebody has to break the chain. It was in that moment, for me, I realized she was struggling for my very soul.
You are listening to the Power of Partnership podcast. If you would like us to share your partnership story, or if you would like to become a proud sponsor of the POP podcast, please contact us at center@partnershipway.org. And now, back to today's episode.
And an important part of my own personal transformation was having the opportunity in 2007, Didan and I went to Ghana to be married. We both, we had grandchildren and all that. We decided we needed to elope. And we went to a slave dungeon, and my friends all said, you're going on your honeymoon and you're going to a slave dungeon? And I said, yes, we are, because anybody that looks like me in the so-called New World has some ancestor that came through one of those slave dungeons. And we were just going to go to pay homage to the fact that we had returned, we were safe. And so that informed our visit to the slave dungeon. But what I had not felt was the impact that that would just make, to be in a women's dungeon where people for 200 years had been bought and sold. I just fell apart. The stories of young virgins being taken up to the governor's bedroom at night, and the women had, I just fell apart. I forgot everything I thought I knew about goodness and oneness. And, I just fell apart. After 2 days of crying, Didan came to me and he said, what hurts so bad? And I explained to him that what hurt so was the erasure, that we know the name of the ship, we knew the investors in the slave ship, we knew when it left Rhode Island and when it arrived in Jamaica, and we knew how many enslaved people it had when it went back. We knew everything except the people, the names of the mothers and the fathers and the children. They were enslaved, they weren't slaves. And it's that hurts so bad, that they have just been erased. And he looked at me and he said, what would healing look like? And Sherry, when you're in the wound, it was an annoying, what healing? Just like I'm here crying, falling apart. And you're asking me what healing, I didn't say anything, but it was like healing. I was very dismissive of it and went back to where I was. But the important thing is that a seed had been planted. And the next morning when I woke up, I went down to the ocean with the slave dungeon in the background, because then I remembered what the elder said to us before we went into the dungeon. The women elders had a ceremony for us, and they said, when you leave the dungeons, you should go to the nearest body of water and watch your feet. Well, because you do not want to walk with all of that sorrow, they said. Well, I went to bed and became embraced by the sorrow. But the next morning I remembered, and I went down, got up early and went down, and I did the ritual washing of my feet. And I kept hearing, plant a tree, plant a tree, just plant a tree. And at some point, I realized that it was a phrase from one of my friend Alice Walker's poems, plant a tree. When they torture your mother, plant a tree. When they torture your father, plant a tree. I had always thought that that was a poem about hopelessness. But in that moment, I realized that it was a poem about hope, and that my question and despair about the erasure of all these people, what if we planted trees in commemoration ceremonially at this particular time of climate crisis in their name and in their honor? We would be calling their energy into this critical moment. I felt like I couldn't come back with all that anger. I was on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I had been on the board of Pioneers. I said I believed in love. I said I believed, and then here I am, this other kind of energetic field that I'm creating and that I'm in. But fortunately, I was honest to be in it, and honest and blown away by in the midst and depths of that sorrow and the ritual washing this plant a tree. And so I realized that, wow, the universe gets us to where we need to be, even when we are not conscious of what it is.
In your case, which was this amazing program that you and Didan started called Growing a Global Heart. So can you share more about the amazing work that you're doing in
Well,
that organization?
that is so interesting because that vision came after I came back and I told him what, and had happened and how we have to go plant, my tears and my rage and my anger, it's plant a tree, plant a tree, plant a tree. And so it was in that moment, as we talked about it, I said it felt like, and he talked about that what was so needed was a global heart, right? And if we're all interconnected, then it's global. And our task was part of maybe what we were being asked to do was to help seed the vision of growing a global heart and to speak from that place, because that really meant that there was no them or us. There's or other. There's only we. There's only us. And the trees, I would really is that's a particular lesson because trees breathe for the whole.
Mm.
So by planting ceremonially trees, the trees didn't say you can't breathe my oxygen because you're African, you can't breathe because you're an enslaver, you can't believe, because you lynched somebody, you know what I mean? The symbol that had emerged in that moment of despair was a symbol that breathed for the whole. And so we then thought that what the journey that we were on was trying to grow a global heart.
And that's what healing looks like.
And that's what healing looks like. That's what healing looks like.
Can you share a bit about what's happening with growing a global heart and your work today?
Yes, and thank you so much for that question. Growing a global heart is involved in trying to seed the vision that we got in Africa, that came through family not looking always the way we were raised to believe it was supposed to look. And so we have been we're involved in a number of collaborative activities, some of them involving young people. And that's what I'm most excited about. And I'm most excited about the collaboration that Growing a Global Heart is having with the Seeds Institute. And it's seeding the future, but it's PSEADS, seeds. And the work that Didan began in elementary schools and high schools, and that Seeds was founded, and he is founding board member emeritus of Seeds, and the amazing work that they are, transformative work that they are doing in California schools using poetry and dialogue and storytelling. That's what I'd really like, to most focus on, and very excited, as I know Didan would be, with the Growing a Global Heart. A transformed heart changes the world. The Power of Love book with so many people, like he would be blown away just with, as I am, by the names of the other contributors, people who I have great respect for. So I really, really want to provide a shout out for The Power of Love, because it is so expansive in terms of contributors. So I feel that too is a reflection of and a continuation of trying to build a kind of global heart and global community. So I would, and then, Danny Glover has, and I have an audio version of I Give You the Springtime of My Blushing Heart, which we would certainly love if that could be highlighted. And we publish a newsletter every other month that people might want to be on that list. We would love it if they were.
Great. Well, for our listeners, I will definitely include links to all of those resources and the Power of Love book and the Seed Foundation, as well, of course, to the Growing a Global Heart Institute, all in the show notes. So you'll be able to easily click on those links and get more information, get more involved. And also in the show notes, of course, will be a link to Riane Eisler's Center for Partnership Systems so that you can sign up for the Changing Our Stories, Changing Our Lives course, or any of the other resources that are on the website. And I also would like to invite all of our listeners to sign up for the Center for Partnership Systems email list. You can sign up for that email list by just clicking on the link that will be in the show notes, or go to the center's main page on the website and click on the Join Us link. So can we speak a bit more, Belvie, now about your work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences? Can you speak more a bit about the expansive power of consciousness and how awakening our consciousness and our inner knowing can be transformative?
That's an important question. One of the most profound experiences that I had while at the Institute was a gathering of Israeli and Palestinian social justice activists together. And it was held in Cyprus because that meant that it was easier for each of them to get there. So and there were people there from the Nelson Mandela Foundation and from various peace and activist groups around the world. Bishop Tutu had a representation. And so and the purpose of the gathering was to provide a safe place for Israeli and Palestinian social justice activists who had been working across this divide for generations. And so they came to share with us what they were doing. One of the things that struck me so about that sharing, in which they were surrounded by all of us, and that they spoke from a deep place of what their work was, it got to be very tearful at some point, because what they said was, people know about the extremes on either side. What we've been doing gets no recognition. And I had to admit that when I got the invitation to fly to Cyprus to meet with British, Palestinian and Israeli social justice activists, I too, and that has really, I wonder how they're doing now. But the fact that in the midst of destruction often, or what feels like destruction, that there are people reaching across that divide. And I like to think that and part of what I came away with in terms of shift in consciousness on their part, and understanding the pain when that's a minority view, and yet having the courage, and having seen what courage looks like in that setting, I left thinking, who would I be in the midst of breakdown were Blacks and white people, would I be the person that held what we committed to Dr. King, that he had learned from Gandhi, that we would hold? And so that effort at recognizing the shift of consciousness and what that means in certain very critical situations and certain very critical moments in history. So I feel like the whole consciousness shift for me became less abstract. I had listened that Edgar's sharing his epiphany and his thinking that he had had a nervous breakdown until he went around the world and talked to indigenous people, and he talked to, went to India. And when he got to India, they said, oh, you just had a Mahdi experience. That's a experience of ecstasy and oneness. I mean, yeah, we know that. I mean, he didn't, yeah, it wasn't even a big deal, right? Native people said to, him in Sweat Lodge, the kinds of insights and, ecstasy that they would feel. But he thought that he didn't know what was wrong. He'd never had that experience before, and to have it in outer space. So to have him write about it and to hear him talk about it made me really aware that shift in consciousness was real. There was an astronaut who came out of the military and whose mission now was oneness and shifting the consciousness. It became less abstract being on the board there. I understood what it was we were attempting to do and what it was that people who understood were hoping we would do.
I wonder, Belvie, if you have any final words you'd like to share with our audience today.
So I feel in this moment the emergence of the grander, a divine design, the reconnection to Riane. You're taking this on to have a global conversation. And I feel is that the divine design part of the journey is seeing what's possible and what's hopeful and finding and rediscovering family does not always look the way we were raised to believe it was supposed to look. We'd been raised to believe that family only was the white people, or family only was the Black people that looked like me, or the family only that spoke the language that I spoke to. I feel what the power and one of the messages of Riane's work is that global, larger than global context for who we are and how we can be in order to honor and express that. And I feel like it's, in the context of that community that is trying to emerge, and that is in fact emerging, and that I agreed to do this because I felt this conversation with you, because most of the news, quote unquote, is negative. So I feel that this is part of that, what's working is the larger conversation that exists. It's not even trying to emerge, as I said, that already exists. When I look at and read some of what the young people that we're working with now in the context of growing global heart in places like Marin, and using poetry, because Didan was a poet, and using poetry to deeply reflect on some of these questions. When I read what they write, I realize that I've lived long enough to be able to, fortunately, to see tomorrow's children.